Hi, Misha here, and today I'm going to look at some of the last propeller, prop-driven fighters in the Royal Navy. I'm going to get to the Sea Hornet, the Havilland Sea Hornet, in just a bit. But we're going to start off with the Hawker Sea Fury. And if this plane looks a little familiar to you, it's because it's really a takeoff, kind of the ultimate version of Hawker's World War II efforts. This model is from Witty, so it's an older model. As far as I know, none of the companies are doing a Sea Fury at the moment. Whereas this model of the Sea Hornet is from Oxford, and it's kind of their, what do they call it, aviation history or legends of whatever. It's their, I think of it as kind of the deluxe Oxford. And I'm going to also compare these two model styles, because there are aspects of each I like and aspects of each I don't. And being a Witty, it comes with the typical Witty stand, which is sufficient. I mean, it's nothing special, but at least you get one. You don't have to buy it. But yeah, the what became the Sea Fury started off way back 42, 43 as the lightweight Typhoon project. And so it was kind of a development of the Typhoon and thus the Tempest. Originally there were two separate programs, one for the Royal Navy, one for the Royal Air Force. Well, Hawker kind of combined the two and decided just to have variations of each. Work began, and it was basically going to be a high-performance fighter bomber. The ground-based Fury first flew in September as a prototype of 1944, with the sea-based Sea Fury flying in February of 45. And initially the RAF ordered the Fury and the Navy ordered the Sea Fury. Well, at the end of the war, VE Day in May, the RAF canceled the Fury, so it never really went into production. But the Sea Fury did. The Royal Navy ordered 100 to begin with. They would acquire more later. The reason is the Royal Air Force had plenty of planes. Spitfires, Hurricanes, Tempests, Typhoons. But most of what the Royal Navy had been using were kind of hand-me-downs. For example, the Seafire, the navalized version of the Spitfire, was never really that great. It was kind of pressed into service and was never a great carrier aircraft. So the Royal Navy had been kind of relying on American planes like the F-4U, F-6F, which were Lend-Lease, which ultimately you would have to either return or purchase. So with that in mind, it decided to go ahead with the Sea Fury. So throughout 1945, 1946, you would have various tests, carrier trials. Long story short, the first production aircraft started to leave the factory in late 46 and started to be delivered to the Royal Navy in mid-47. Now actually Canada was the first to have an active squadron by August of 47, but the Royal Navy would soon follow in September, October of that year, and started putting these on board its vessels a short time later. So what do we have here? Well, if you've seen my video on the Typhoon or the Tempest, the overall design looks pretty familiar. This was built with the Centaurus engine, although they did try it with the Griffin as well. Overall, we're about 35 feet by 38 feet, so typical size. This was designed from the outset to be a fighter bomber, so it could always carry either 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, or drop tanks, and 12, or even in some cases 16, 3-inch rockets. It was also armed with 4 20mm cannon. Had a maximum altitude of just shy of 36,000 feet, so very much in with the Typhoon and Tempest there. But this was a very fast plane, one of the fastest propeller-driven fighters. It could reach about 460 miles per hour, and was generally speaking a very advanced, very modern plane for its day and time. One of the most advanced military prop fighters. Had very advanced avionics, radar, so on and so forth. This would be a relatively good export for Hawker. As I said, Canada would purchase it, also Australia, Egypt, and others. And the Royal Navy would continue to buy these. They would end up making over 860, with the FB-11 version being the most produced and most popular, which was a specialized fighter-bomber variant. And this would see service during the Korean War. In fact, it saw very heavy use early on during the war in 1950. Of course, as time went on, these would be supplemented and then supplanted by newer jets. Of course, the American F-86 and eventually Hawker's own Seahawk. But they definitely carried the war and remained in service throughout. They were used as dogfighters. In fact, the Sea Fury holds the distinction of being one of the few prop planes to have shot down a jet. In 1952, during the war, a Sea Fury shot down a MiG-15 flown by the Chinese Air Force. So that was something to be pretty impressed by. And the plane had a good history. It was used to ground attack, to bomb installations, railways, communications, supply lines, and was quite effective at doing that. But really, with the advancement of jets, its days were obviously going to be numbered. Production would end in 1955, and they would be shortly removed from the Royal Navy, first from active service and then from the reserves. Some would stay in service a while longer in other nations, especially third world nations, because it was a good, dependable, and a very high-performance plane for being a propeller-driven. But, of course, by the late 50s, we were already into the second generation of jet fighters, which would more or less completely eclipse this, no matter how advanced it was for its day and time. So this was kind of the last of a generation. But it's also interesting to look at this compared to the Seahawk and see how that carried over as well. So, with that said, what about the Sea Hornet? Well, moving on. Just as the Sea Fury was kind of advanced from the Tempest, the Hornet and Sea Hornet were loosely based on de Havilland's highly successful Mosquito. And by that I mean, this is very obviously a 2-engine aircraft. And it was predominantly manufactured with wood, using metal only where necessary. It just used a lot of the same design concepts. And this was another one of the last propeller fighters in the Royal Navy, and for that matter, the Royal Air Force. And it really dates back all the way to 1941. And kind of an interesting thing, but something you see a lot with de Havilland, they had a pretty crackerjack R&D team. And at that time, the Mosquito was in production, and the project, which would eventually become the Vampire, was still waiting on jet engines. So they started working on a long-range night fighter. Well, that would kind of bleed over 1942 into having a long-range fighter for the Pacific. Now, think about the American P-38. Same idea. Having something that can go real far, deliver a punch, be a good dogfighter or light bomber, and come back. At first, the Royal Air Force and Royal Navy weren't too interested, but by 1943, when the war had kind of turned from being defensive to offensive, they issued a specification, and luckily the DH-103 was already kind of on the design board, at least the idea for it, and it was seen that the Navy would have more of a pressing need. Obviously, again, like I said, use in the Pacific, so the navalized version was given priority. Well, fast forward to July of 1944, and the first Hornet prototype flew. So pretty quick turnaround time there. And initially, both the RAF and Royal Navy would order these, and they would have production up and going by 1945, so missed the war, but orders were kept in. Prototype flights, yada yada. By 1946, the Royal Air Force would have its first Hornet squadrons, and by June, July of 1947, the Royal Navy would have its first Sea Hornets. So it came into service right around the same time as the Sea Fury. That said, it really didn't go far. But that's not the plane's fault. This was actually a very good plane. It was designed to take full advantage of the most up-to-date version of the Merlin engine, so a tried and tested engine. It was fast. It could get up to 475 miles per hour, and it could climb over 40,000 feet. It's 35.5 feet long with a 45-foot wingspan. It can carry a 1,000-pound bomb under each wing, or up to 8 rockets. And like the Sea Fury, it has 4 20mm cannon. The Royal Air Force would end up with around 180 of these, and the Royal Navy would get around 150. Total production, including for export and prototypes and all like that, was around 380, so quite a bit smaller number than the Sea Fury. The thing is, by the time this plane was in production, there wasn't really much of a need. They did have a few different versions, including a night fighter with 2-seat cockpit with radar, and a photo reconnaissance version, which actually did pretty well because of the plane's altitude and speed. But being an all-wood plane, not to mention propeller-driven in the late 40s, it even seemed more dated than the Fury. With that in mind, production ended in 1950, and exports were pretty light. That said, it did set some pretty good records in its day. The RAF would only really deploy this during the Malayan emergency in 1951, and start pulling these out of service a short time later, with the last missions for the Hornet flown in 1955, and pretty much all of them officially out of service by 1956. In the Royal Navy, they would do carrier trials in 48, and then from 49 to 51, these would be stationed on 2 full-size carriers. But already by 51, since the Korean War was heating up, they would be replaced by first the Sea Fury and then later the Sea Hawk. So their carrier days were very, very brief, actually less than 2 years. They did try flying these from escort carriers, but it just didn't work. Just did not work at all. So, without really having a use for it, the Royal Navy mothballed their Sea Hornet fleet between 1952 and 1954, with the last ones out of service at that time. Fun fact, while the 300 some odd military planes in British service were put into storage, because they were made of wood, they essentially rotted away, at least enough that they weren't considered salvageable. So most Hornets were scrapped in the mid to late 50s, just dismantled or crushed up. And that was pretty much it. So not a nice plane. It would have been a great plane for World War II, but it just didn't really have a whole lot or a very long service. So, there's a brief history of each one. What about the models? How does the Oxford compare with the good old Witty? So comparing the models, both are 1/72 scale, and both are classified as diecast. Both also cost around the same, $40. At least the Witty did. I think they still do, but yeah, same price point. Cheaper than a Corgi or Hobby Master, but more expensive than your little diecast. But in other ways, kind of where one excels and the other fails, and then the reverse happens. There'll be good points about one and about the other. Both do have moving propellers. However, definitely the Oxford here, the propellers are a little stickier. They don't really spin. You can move them, but they don't have a lot of spin to them. It's kind of, rough. Whereas the Witty here is very spinny. And this is the case for pretty much all the Witties and high-end Oxfords that I own. All the high-end Oxfords, the propellers are a little sticky. They might smooth out, or I'm sure a model person could fix it, but it's not really a broken thing. It's just the polymer, the plastic's a little rougher there, but on the Witty, it's just smooth. I like that. It feels good. Also, the Witty is made of very heavy metal and feels like a very heavy aircraft. The ordnance come fixed under the wings, already on. Compared to the Oxford, it's a little lighter metal, and I'd say it's more plastic used in it. Still got a good chunk of heft to it, but it's a little lighter. It feels a little more, I don't know, but this may be a pro or a con. The ordnance you can install or not. I think it's kind of nice to have it removable. Both do come with 2 drop tanks each. The Hornet has 4 rockets, and I can't remember, this has 4 or 6. It has 4 as well. So yeah, each have kind of the same wing loading with a total of 4 rockets and 2 tanks. It's just they're removable on the Oxford. Neither one has opening canopy. One nice thing, if you know me, the landing gear can be displayed up or down on the Oxford here, which I really like. It's just one of those features I really like. Whereas on the Witty, as with most Witty, the landing gear is permanently in the down position. That said, the landing gear is metal. And typically with the Witties, the wheels will roll. But to be fair, typically with the higher end Oxfords, they can as well. So definitely a point there in the Oxford's favor in my book. Another thing I like better about the Oxfords, I like their stands. They have a wider base, and they have a very large square plug they sit on, but they don't sit too tight on their stands. I mean, they sit on securely, but not like where you have to kind of wedge them in with some of the other brands. So it's a nice secure stand. And I also like how they sit on it canted, which means you can get more on a shelf, you know, wing to wing, just when they're looking like they're banking. Whereas the Witty, they've got Witty stands. Where did I put that? I mean, it's adequate, but the base is relatively flimsy. But the thing is, it has this tiny little nub. And usually when the models are new, you kind of have to wiggle them in. There's usually a little paint overflow. It keeps the small hole in the bottom a little narrow. So I always feel like they might topple off because they don't insert very deeply. They do fit tight, but yeah, I feel like the stand on these Oxford, it's a better stand. And the plane fits on and off without a hassle. Also, for what it's worth, if you're a box collector, which I am not, these come in very nice boxes. Among the nice stuff I've ever seen. They have a slip case, and they have kind of a patterned exterior. Kind of feels like an old-fashioned book. And then the flap is magnetically sealed, and then it comes in a nice foam bed. One of the nicest boxes of all time. Whereas the Witty, you know, just comes in the pretty typical, I guess you call it blister pack inside with a cardboard outer sleeve. But since I'm not a box collector, I could care less. But presentation, even to me, does matter. So, yeah. Both have pros and cons. Both are the same price point. All in all, I guess I would give the slight edge to the Oxford just for the better presentation and the ability to display ordnance on or off and landing gear up or down. So as a display model, you have more going on. However, the Witty is just a more substantial, solid feeling model. The metal's heavier, and it feels like it's just more durable. So there's that. But there's only one way to display it. On the stand or off the stand, I guess, are your two options. But the gear are always down and the ordnance is on unless you want to, you know, remove it. But yeah, then there's other issues. So as a display model, there's a little to be desired for flexibility. Also, Witty did mostly standard planes. They didn't do a whole lot of kind of odd planes, whereas Oxford in this line has done some pretty neat planes that no one else has ever done. That's kind of why I've ended up buying these. That plus the price point. But, yeah, I just kind of feel like they're offering some neat things to us collectors. And it took me a while to do the Hornet, or Sea Hornet in this case, because I was kind of confused why there were Oxfords out there at the higher price point. Very few of the websites mention the gear up or down and other features. So I was a little confused. The Witty I knew I was getting. I like the evolution of the Hawker design from the Hurricane, or really even the original Fury, the biplane onward. In fact, one day I plan on doing a video kind of the whole Hawker line laid out. I think that'd be fun. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed this. Kind of two more obscure planes from the late 40s, early 50s. It's funny, you know, in Britain you jump from prop planes to kind of straight into the jet age. But yeah, any questions or comments, please do post those below. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. And also, if you could, check out some of my other videos. This is Misha. Appreciate you tuning in, and please do so again next time.